Swale, good people in Stalo territory and beyond. Welcome to the fourth in a series of online conversations sponsored by the Xwelíqweltel government. Our hope is that these chats will light the fire in our community members as we continue on a path to implementing our inherent right to self-determination and self-government. We're literally taking our own future into our hands. Since this event is streaming live on our public Facebook page, don't hesitate to invite family members, friends, community members to join in and watch the discussion as it unfolds. This is also going to be posted to our YouTube channel afterwards so people can see it at their leisure. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is líya Xwelíqweltel Nation. I work with the Xwelíqweltel government, formerly known as the SXTA, Xwelíqweltel Treaty Association. The leaders in our 6 communities are in the process of reclaiming our governance role and shifting our identity to SXG. Our communities are Achilitz, Lacamel, Xwelíqweltel, Xwelíqweltel, and Xwelíq. Tonight, our host, Xwelíqweltel Grand Chief Stephen Point, will speak with the honored guest, Grand Chief Clarence, Uncle Cat Pennier, about a very timely but difficult topic for our communities. I just want to give a trigger warning to anybody out there that might be watching. We are going to be covering some difficult and potentially re-traumatizing ground in our conversation tonight. I actually just came from a discussion at Kwantlen Polytechnic University where I screened a film about transgender people in our communities, and we had an elder there with us. And the elder brought up some of the trauma that they've survived through day schools. And so we know that these traumas are very alive in our communities today, not just through those who directly experience them, but through the descendants. So tonight, it's been just over a year since the discovery of the 215 unmarked graves in Kamloops at the former residential school site. In that time, many other communities have come forward with similar news about potential grave sites. Since then, the rest of Canada and the world has been struck by the shocking truth that our community members have always known, that some of our children went to these schools and they never returned home. Before we get started, I'll briefly introduce Xwelíqweltel, who is SXG's in-house legal advisor, the Chancellor of the University of British Columbia and a former Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia. Grand Chief Point practiced law and sat on the provincial court bench for many years. He's also a member of the Xwelíqweltel First Nation and served as chief of our community for 15 years between 1975 and 1999. From 1994 to 1999, he served as tribal chair of the Stalo Nation. During that time, the Stalo Nation entered into the BC Treaty process. Grand Chief Clarence Pennier, better known as Cat, Uncle Cat to many of us, has also been involved in the Stalo Nation's rights and title efforts for many years. He is currently the manager of Aboriginal Rights and Title at the Stalo Tribal Council, in addition to his role with the Indian Residential School program work that we will discuss tonight. He's worked as a senior manager for the Stalo Nation, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, Xwelíqweltel Cultural Center, and more. He draws upon cultural and ancestral teachings to battle drugs that are harming our children and families. My role tonight in the conversation is to start things off with a question or two and just allow the conversation to roll from there. Then at about the 40-minute mark or so, we will leave time for audience members to ask questions of our knowledgeable panel members tonight. These can be posted either on Facebook Live or the YouTube chat, or emailed to outreach@sxta.bc.ca. Perhaps some of our technical assistants can post that email on Facebook so that people can copy that if that's how they want to send in their questions tonight. So I'd like to first offer that we do an opening prayer as is our traditional and cultural way, not only in Stalo territory, but right across Turtle Island. And that is not only to bless the meeting and the discussion that we have tonight, but to have a prayer for all those that may be watching and witnessing tonight as it unfolds. Either Xwelíqweltel or Uncle Cat, of course, you're welcome to take on the prayer tonight before we continue on to the question portion of the evening.
Stephen.
Okay. Grandfather, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for the circle that's been formed this evening. We ask for a special blessing on all those involved this evening, especially our guest tonight, Grand Chief Clarence Pennier. We ask that you join us in our dialogue, Grandfather, to help us to make good words and good thoughts for ourselves and our families at home who are listening. We bless anyone, Grandfather, please, who may be still suffering from COVID or be grieving from a loss of a loved one at home. Grandfather, we give thanks for our dialogue tonight. The whole Grandfather.
Everything I thought I knew about my dad.
We're getting some background there, I guess.
Yeah, perhaps when you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself, that's going to lessen the noise that's going through the audio channels to all the people that are listening to us. That's helpful. Thank you. And again, we just want to preface the conversation tonight with a trigger warning that the topics we're going to be talking about are potentially traumatizing and sensitive. So I'm going to start off the top. Since the announcement in Kamloops, many communities have come forward with their work to find grave sites at residential schools. In our own area, we had 3 schools, Xwelíqweltel here in Chilkoot territory, St. Mary's in Mission, as well as All Hallows in Yale. Uncle Cat, can you tell us a little bit about the work you've taken on and where we are at this point in time in light of these schools in our area?
Thank you. And it's an important question. And sometime after, like I mentioned, that after the 215 were discovered in Kamloops, my wife and I went up there at the time to witness the activities that went on. And after we came home, and Stalo Nation through Dave Shippey and his staff had done a proposal to the federal government to do investigations on Xwelíqweltel, St. Mary's, and All Hallows. And a lot of it was around the research activities that are necessary to find out who attended those schools and if there was any records in place in terms of anyone who went missing and didn't return home, and also responsible for doing the ground searches for the schools. So Stalo Tribal Council had sent proposal into the provincial government to do the interviews with survivors from St. Mary's. And it's a large task because people came from Lillooet territory, came from the Chonlath territory, came from throughout Coast Salish territory, from part of Tlakatmuk territory. So in terms of trying to find out who's still around and who wants to tell their stories, that's a challenge that's facing us in terms of the work we have to do. At the present time, I have 3 counselors or 3 interviewers in place, and responsibility to go out and, like I said, interview survivors who are willing to tell their stories. I'm not too sure of the numbers that they've interviewed so far. And like one of our interviewers just had to go out to Duncan yesterday to interview an elder out there. So it involves a bit of travel. And the challenge that we have, like I said, we have people who came from the Chonlath territory. And we're trying to work with the people who are responsible for doing work in those 3 schools out there. If they can interview all of the Chonlath people and just share those that came to St. Mary's with us, it would be helpful. And we, in turn, if we have people living in Stala territory who went to other schools, we would do the interviews and just share those stories with those other schools as well. So that's what's happening in terms of our activities with the tribal council, trying to go out and interview survivors. And it's going to be a slow process because we know that some people may have already told their stories to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Some may have told their stories to the independent assessment process. And some people told their stories to a group that had done interviews on St. Mary's when they produced a book called Amongst God's Own. So part of the challenge is asking those individuals if they want to have their stories shared with our collection that we're going to be getting over the next number of months. And what we hope to do in the end is hire a writer that would review all of these stories and put a book together that would demonstrate a lot of different things that happened to our people in the schools over the number of years. It won't be really telling their particular story, but it'll be part and parcel of the book to leave some information so that our future generations can understand why we're the way we are, why it is our communities have to go through a long process of healing, over the years. So we have to have those kinds of things looked at for our children. So that's part of what I can tell you now. And I'll just mention, like I said, Dave Sheppy and his staff are responsible for doing the ground searches, and in our discussions, probably in August, maybe sometime when the ground is pretty solid, that would be the time that the ground searches would be taking place in St. Mary's. there's a large properties to be searched, so that's where we're at in terms of doing interviews. We are going out to gather the stories, and Dave and I keep in contact about their activities for research and for ground searches. Okay for now.
So in terms of hearing from survivors about their experience, how do you feel that informs maybe not just the public at large who have no idea about the atrocities of residential schools, but perhaps some of the work moving forward of our leaders, of our chiefs, of our program directors? Where is this going? You know, for myself, I think about the understanding I have for our elders and what our elders have been through, how that informs my values and what I feel like is important. But, you know, in terms of a collective as a community, why is it important for these stories to come out?
Well, it's important so that we can have some change in the way we look at ourselves as people, because, you know, damage has been done through the generations, and people have to understand that it, you know, when you look at the statistics that are produced, a large number of our people are in Downtown Eastside. A large population we have in the prison system, and there's a high percentage of women in the prisons now. It's around 50%, which is pretty high, and it shouldn't be like that. And the other thing is our children are still being taken away from our families and our communities. So people have to understand that the impacts that have been on our people over the years without us going through the proper healing procedures as individuals and as families and as a community. That's why the statistics are there. So we have to do a lot of work to make sure that our future generations aren't going to be going through the same thing that we have gone through. So that's why it's important for people to understand, and for the Xwelíqweltel to understand that we need their help in terms of better understanding, so that they can help us with our causes of trying to make sure that we have a good world for our seventh generation into the future. So that's what we have to be doing. And not only letting our own people know, but letting the Xwelíqweltel know that just to be there with us, stand with us, not to criticize us or anything like that.
Hey, Chief, I was listening to what you're saying about getting these interviews done with 3 staff members, and you're contacting survivors from St. Mary's. I was wondering, like, I know a lot of that, what I've heard and understood is that survivors, a lot of them have passed away already. But they did leave stories with their children, the second generation. Is it possible to interview some of those second generation survivors too, or are you going to do that?
Oh, of course, we will have to do that. If the survivors from the schools had told their children, and their children are willing to do the interviews to tell their story, that would be very helpful to all of us, and would help those individuals also to be able to go through their own healing process, telling the stories of why their parents were their grandparents and great grandparents, whatever happened to them in the residential schools. And the other thing is, it's going to take time to be able to reach people in our communities. You know, I've sent emails to the chiefs. I've done an interview with CBC. We put an article in the local papers to let people know that that's what we're trying to do, is get out and interview the survivors or their children, or even some people who a survivor would have a friendship with and talk to that person, if not even part of the family, but you know, that person could tell a story, and as long as they have that understanding with the family, they're doing it because their family member talked to them about their experiences.
You also mentioned that the survivors, many of them have already spoken to either the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or these folks that developed this book called Amongst God's Own, or the independent research group that did this independent report.
It is the independent assessment process.
Yeah, the independent assessment process. I was wondering though, in light of the children that have been found now and on my grave note, will your work be also collecting maybe information that wasn't asked in the first few rounds of these discussions? The lost children?
Well, if the survivors want to add to their stories, you know, if they remember or something jogged their memory, like the finding of the 215 would probably jog people's memories.
Mhm.
Excuse me. And they would say, yeah, I remember that possibly one of the classmates that I had suddenly disappeared and didn't come to class anymore.
Mhm.
Something could have happened to that person, so that would jog people's memories, you know.
Mhm.
And it would lead to investigations of, you know, the residential school properties.
Just a technical thing. Uncle Cat, you have either like a radio or something on in the background. It's causing some bleed. That it, when other people are talking, it's kind of hard to hear. That way the lines will be clear there. Just that way we can hear everybody more clearly. Thank you. So I think what is interesting probably isn't the right word, but what it makes me think of when you talk about some of these stories coming out now and people having to tell their story and retell their story, and now someone wants to interview them again. You know, we talk about re-traumatization or triggers, and that sometimes brings about waves of anxiety, you know, not just for the survivors, but the survivors and their families, and maybe starting to think about things that we never thought about before. And some of the dialogue that we've had and talked about, you know, in our family, in our community, has been how much of the residential school mentality, the abuse, the Catholic or Christian teachings have seeped into our homes, into our political structures, into our culture. You know, some of the things that we see practiced don't seem like they would have come from a Xwelíqweltel place or worldview. It seems very much tainted by that militant, abusive residential school mentality. And that is, unfortunately, that's the only thing our great-grandparents, our grandparents knew, was that kind of upbringing. And I had my own parents tell me at one time in my life, we didn't know how to be parents. We weren't raised in that way. Our parents were residential school survivors, so we're just trying to undo some of that damage now the best way that we can. And so I was really interested to hear your thoughts. You're both leaders, have been in that position most of your lives. Do you notice that? Do you see that in your work and in some of the cultural spaces? You think, oh, that seems a little bit more like residential school influence, or that it doesn't really belong anymore in our cultural practices and spaces. That's not a safe way for us to continue on. Like, what are your thoughts around this untangling, what some people might be calling reconciliation? I had an elder today say, I don't understand that word. My body doesn't accept that word because I'm not there yet. I haven't dealt with my own trauma. So I was interested to hear what your thoughts are around that.
Wow. It's to be able to get to a different stage in my life. I had to sit with a counselor for a couple of years so I could be able to tell my story without getting emotional about everything, because it wasn't, I could tell people that I was sexually abused when I was fairly young, but I was also physically abused by getting strapped and things like that. And that's learned behavior that we brought back to our families and our communities. And it, you know, people would become physically abusive with their mates, with their children. And it has to stop sometime. The other part of the effects from that is all of the what's that, lateral violence that we use in our communities, where we put people down, we say they're lesser than us, or we're better than them, or we talk about them and gossip about them and tell lies about them and things like that. It's part of the learned behavior that we got out of those institutions. But in the end, we need to have more of our leaders talk about the whole issue, because that's one of the things that they don't do enough of. We don't raise it around the boardrooms, tables. We talk about the political things that are there. We talk about maybe how we should be governing ourselves, but we don't really get to the whole issues about our people need to be able to get to a better place. Because I know we had one lateral violence workshop in our community, and we're supposed to have another one, and probably need a few more after that, just to get everything out on the table so that we can sit down amongst ourselves, our families, so we can talk to each other. And that's one of the things that was taken away from us in residential schools is our ability to be a family. I explained to people that all my brothers and sisters went to school and we were a dysfunctional family after that, after we all got out, because we never really talked about what impact it had on each of us and how it impacts our children and grandchildren. Because I think some of our grandchildren are going to be better off than our children, because we treat them a little different, because we have a little bit of experience with our children. We know how to raise them a little better. So some of my thoughts about it. Over to you, Stephen.
Well, we're really in I would say, uncharted territory as Indigenous people. As Kat says, this isn't a subject that's been really examined very well in Indigenous communities. That is the overall social impact that residential schools have had and continue to have on things like parenting, on things like sexual assault, sexual abuse, lateral violence, family violence, substance abuse, suicide. You take a look at the horrendous statistics that we have in our communities, the overrepresentation of our youth in prison. Right now, half of the inmates, juveniles, are Indigenous in the Fraser Valley. We're overrepresented in the penitentiary systems. We die younger from violent diseases, but violent accidents. We have a suicide rate that's 6 times higher than the national average for young people. And so when we look at the actual legacy of residential schools, I mean, and you can't say that everything that's happening in First Nations communities is as a result of what went on in residential schools, because residential school is only one of the impacts, but it had a significant role to play in why and how First Nations are the way they are now. You know, for a large part, I think when I was growing up, when you saw someone who was intoxicated on the side of the street, it was often an Indigenous person. And that person was viewed by the general society as being all of us. We were all that person. That was who we were. And I think we believe that. I think that Indigenous people has had internalized all of the negative stuff that was said to them in residential schools, that were nobodies, that were savages, that we undereducated, that were uncivilized. All of these things that were said to Indigenous people in residential schools was internalized. And Indigenous people, in my view, suffer from a massive inferiority complex. And to the extent that kids in public schools, when I was going through public schools in the 70s, working in all of those kids quit at grade 10 because they didn't have the competence to carry on in a public school system. And the flip side of that is that white society, in my view, has this massive superiority complex that comes with the whole notion of their progressive industrial society that's educated, scientific, and bringing forth all of its Western values and ideas. And so when you juxtapose socially the fact that Europeans, I think, have come to this country with an inbuilt sense of superiority, and in a lot of cases wanting to civilize the Indians and bring to them all the benefits of civilization, blah, blah, blah. You have, on the other hand, this large group of indigenous people who are suffering from this idea that we're not as good as everybody else. And so the substance abuse and the suicide is really an awful lot has to do with the way that indigenous people have internalized that message that we're not as good as other people. And the sad impact, one of the worst impacts, is when European traders arrived from San Francisco during the gold rush. They brought with them crude alcohol that they sold and made sometimes out of kerosene, and they sold that to indigenous people. They sold it, and indigenous people began to get intoxicated. Leaders began to get intoxicated. Historians, our teachers, and when you talk to people who came through that period and lived in that time, the indigenous people, by and large, by community, were intoxicated. I grew up in a time in the 50s and 60s when you could go to most communities. When I was growing up, everybody was intoxicated. Everybody on the weekends. They'd go to work all right, but they'd be intoxicated. So the intoxication and alcohol was the secondary impact that came with Europeans when they arrived in the gold rush days. The other huge impact was the fact that we were removed from our traditional territories, placed on reservations, and required to stay there. It was government policy that you couldn't leave your reserve without the permit from the government. So the fact that we couldn't go out and live off the land and do what we wanted to do in terms of hunting and fishing and gathering food, and we're forced to live inside these communities and not to leave, right, was a huge social impact. And then have our children taken away and put into residential schools and denied access to their own parents, denied access even to their own brothers and sisters, and then subjected to in many cases, many of the schools, to the physical and sexual abuse by people that were supposed to be taking care of them. These kids came out of these institutions broken people, and they weren't given any counseling. They weren't given the time to recuperate. They were sent home after 8 years of a mediocre education, and told you're on your own now, you know. And so, did they have parenting skills? How could they have parenting skills when they were raised in an institution? They didn't have parenting skills. Were they prepared to get a job and to work in society? No, they weren't. They weren't given an education that allowed them to participate on an equal footing with anyone. Many of the Native men actually left Canada, went to the United States to find work and to get jobs. Because the racism, which was a secondary impact along with alcoholism, was a huge byproduct of the relationship between indigenous people and white society. Racism was so bad. I mean, people wonder why indigenous people eat Chinese foods, because those are the only restaurants that would allow us in. Back in the 40s and 50s, they fed us. They allowed us to come in. And the racism, to a large extent, it may have gone less obvious these days, but it's still there. It's still prevalent. And so residential schools is one aspect and one impact, huge impact on Indigenous people. I remember as a lawyer talking with a student who was following up doing a paper at university about sexual assault in First Nations communities. I'm not going to tell you the community she was writing about, but she said, she made this comment to me. She said, "Well, it's cultural, isn't it?" I go, "What?" She said, "Well, it's cultural, isn't it? I mean, that's part of our culture." And I said, "No, it's not." Why do you think that that's part of our culture? It's not part of our culture. We were raised in 5-generation family longhouses where we were raised by your grandparents. And we were taught to respect women. We were taught to respect your fathers and mothers worked out and fed the families, and you know, children were protected, and this whole notion became skewed and totally off-center in communities where families were subjected, young people were subjected to this abuse that they got in residential school. It almost became a norm, like, oh, that's just to be expected. I remember hearing an elder, and I won't tell you the event that I was at, when he stood up and said, if we have to arrest everybody in the community for sexual abuse, nobody would be left, he said. I said, gee whiz. That's how bad it was for a while. It's not that bad anymore, of course. Things have improved dramatically since AA started allowing people to sober up, since people began to go back to the culture, and the longhouses and the sweat lodges arrived, and people began to do the healing that was necessary to get them away from addictions and family violence, and get the counseling they needed. But as Kat says, there's a long ways to go for our people to heal, and these stories that keep coming out from the residential school need to be heard, so that the general impression that society has of Indigenous people can begin to change. I was interviewed in CBC one time, and they opened the line for callers, and the lady phoned in. She said, I don't know why you Indians, you know, are so upset at us. You know, we brought you everything. We got you civilization. We got you education. And you know, besides, we didn't kill you all up like they're doing the blacks in the United States. I go, gee whiz, thanks a lot. You know, it's this general idea that we should be grateful for all of the stuff that Western society has brought to us, right? And it's a really skewed version of the history of what's happened to Indigenous people. And one of the biggest lessons that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that people who went and listened to the reports and listened to the interviews and listened to the speakers were coming away and saying, we didn't know. Why wasn't this told to us? A lot of people came in, this didn't happen in Canada. They refused to believe that residential schools even happened in Canada. They said that these people are making this all up. No, they're not. This is exactly what happened. Our culture was outlawed by the federal government in the Indian Act in the 1880s. People were arrested for dancing and singing. You weren't allowed to hire lawyers to fight for your rights. And they were saying, this couldn't happen in Canada. We're a progressive country. Well, they got this wonderful vision about what Canada is all about. When you start telling them what happened to Indigenous people, a lot of people just refuse to believe it. And so they need to hear these stories. They need to hear what happened to Indigenous people in residential schools, simply because first, they don't know. Second, they have no understanding of why Indigenous people are the way they are. And they tend to blame Indigenous people themselves. It's just your fault. I was speaking at a school one time in Chilliwack, and talking to the grade 11s about Indigenous rights. And the young teacher took me into the coffee shop after, the coffee room with the other teachers were having coffee. She said, you know, my grandfather after the Second World War was German. He came here from Germany. He was hated by other Canadians. He didn't speak English. But look at him today. He's a successful farmer. He owns a great big farm, has all these cows, and he's very, very sick. He says, what's wrong with you people? I was going, oh my God, this is a teacher, right? Teaching our kids. No idea about the history of Indigenous people, no idea what's happened to them, no understanding or appreciation of everything that they've gone through. And so that the tremendous opportunity that we have here to begin to tell our own story, to tell the Canadians from our own people's mouths what happened to them in the schools is a tremendous opportunity for both healing for our own people and for getting a better understanding from Canadians generally. Actually, Canada doesn't have enough money to compensate Indian people for what they've done to Indians. There's not enough money there. And money isn't going to solve it either. How do you solve the impacts for Indigenous people for the last 150 years? How do you solve that? You know, one of the things that I've come to realize is that no one's going to come to my community and say, "Oh, I'm going to heal you." That's not going to happen. Indigenous people have to heal themselves. They have to find ways and means to do that on their own. And they've got to be given the resources to find their own ways of healing, because it's not going to happen by somebody setting up a program somewhere that allows people to, they think they're going to turn their life around. Indigenous people have got to be given the resource to find their own ways of healing, their own spirituality, their own religious beliefs, their own elders, their own herbal medicines. I found great solace just building a sweat lodge. I just built one just a few days ago. I tell you, after I finished building, I felt better. I was like, whoa, I feel better. And we need to give Indigenous people the space and the resources to begin to do their healing on their own. And it's going to take time. It's just going to take time.
Thank you both for your comments and your perspective from your own personal journeys. And, you know, just as Indigenous men and leaders, you've seen a lot, experienced a lot, as Uncle Kat said around the boardroom table. I think many times people don't realize this is lateral violence. This is my own trauma that's not allowing us to come to a conclusion or a decision today. Or, you know, in these cultural spaces, sometimes we are the ones that are tainting the experience because we have unresolved trauma. And I love that you brought up the point across that these outside communities, the Xwelíqweltels, the settlers, the non-Stalo people that live in our territory, you know, they can make life a lot harder for Indigenous people, or they can make the relationship a lot better. And there can be understanding, or there can be hate and racism. And which one is better for all of us moving forward together? And so that sort of brings me to the next topic for discussion. Since the 215, you know, the orange shirt movement has grown exponentially. You see it in more schools, you see it on the news. The average, let's say, potentially the average Canadian talking about, I didn't know about this, I didn't learn about this in school. This is my first time hearing about residential schools. They had no idea. Or there's that detachment. That was my grandparents, that's not mine to own. And that happened so long ago. So you get all kinds of commentary and attitudes from settlers and their reaction to the 215 and the discovery. How do you feel that the education can continue? What are some of the initiatives that you've seen that are working in, you know, maybe in our communities and the school systems, that are going to take us to that next stage in reconciliation? Because I truly do believe that without the buy-in from the outside community, the settler community, who we have to now share this territory with, whether we like it or not, you know, a lot of things can't happen. A lot of partnerships can't happen without that base understanding. And it's going to allow for our country to grow. How do you think that education is going to continue now into the future around the discovery, the stories being told, around, you know, the narrative that that needs to be shared now, maybe not even just within Canada, but around the world. What are some of the ways and the initiatives you see happening on the horizon?
To me, probably people are going to be learning more now because the provincial government passed DRIPA, which is the United Nations Declaration of the Indigenous Peoples Act. And the federal government also passed a similar act in British Columbia, or British Columbia copied Ottawa's anyway. But those two, they're supposed to come up with action plans and how they have to implement those acts, and they have to do it in talking to our people and making sure that we both understand what the changes are that have to happen down the road. And part of it, they have to take a look at their laws that they have in place that prevent us from doing a lot of different things with our land and our resources. So those are some of the changes that have to come down the road. You know, they talk about reconciliation, but reconciliation is not just being nice to us, talking to us. And the other part of the reconciliation is dealing with land issues, because that's one of the things we're fighting for. Our ancestors fought for the land question. Who owns the land? You say you do, and we say we do. Show us your bill of sale, how you got our territory. You know, those are the questions that they had asked a long time ago. And of course, the governments never could prove that they got it. It's all goes back to them coming into our country and saying they own the land, and that was through the doctrine of discovery, or terra nullius, that this is no man's land, so we're going to come in and take it over, and he'll be our slave, so to speak. You know, those are, it's going to take a while to get there to change the way politicians look at things, but it has to start with in our local communities, where we educate the people in the community so that they can send people to governments that are going to change things. So it has to be a change in the political system that they have in place. You know, we always say that, oh, such and such a good person is going to get elected to be an MLA or to be an MP. But when that person goes to Ottawa or to Victoria, they really can't make any changes because they got to follow the Liberal Party line or Conservative Party line. So, you know, even though the good people are not, they can't really make any changes. So like I said, with those passage of those different acts, that they're supposed to look at the laws and make them consistent with the UN Declaration, and talks about our right to our right to self-government, our right to self-determination. So, but the other side of the coin is we haven't really sat down to talk amongst ourselves about what we want the governments to recognize and affirm for us. We fight in court, but it doesn't always get us the bigger picture. It gets us little pieces in fishing or hunting or harvesting or something. So that's part of what we have to do ourselves.
Where do you feel like self-governance is taking our people if we take charge of our own land, of our own resources, of the things the government has been in charge of, children and families, fishing, where do you see self-government taking our people in the next generation?
Our people have to become a little more educated about the way our system worked when we weren't under the Indian Act, because that was how we lived, right? We lived off the land. We looked after the land, the water, the air, looked after all of the resources and made sure that we didn't over-harvest anything. And right now it's a problem for the governments because they need money. And how do they get money? They got to go and do the mining. They got to do the damming of the rivers and all those different other things that have a cumulative impact on land and water. So somewhere down the road, there has to be sort of meeting of the minds on that it isn't always, it shouldn't be like that, because we only have one planet to live on, and it's being destroyed throughout the world because of extraction and not really following the way we really conserve everything. Because when you look at the species that are at risk now, a lot of animals that are at risk because of their habitat being destroyed, whether it's on land or water. And it wasn't always like that, because all those things helped us to live a good life.
That's interesting because we're having to fight for things that inherently we own. We're asking for land back that actually has been under our ownership and charge all along. And we're having to deal with a government who has no idea of the values that come with Indigenous leadership. No idea about the history of the land and what has been passed down from, I guess, our ancestors in terms of what our responsibility is. And we can't uphold that responsibility because the government stands in between us and our rights to the land. So just thinking along those lines and what you guys have been fighting for throughout the time of your leadership, what is one thing you wish you could see in your lifetime? If you could see one thing, check off your list, one thing you've been working for to be achieved, what would that be?
Excuse me. Well, one of the things I would like to see is a little more a change in attitude from corporations and those who invest in corporations, because they, like I say, they're after the almighty dollar to make sure they get the best profits that they can. It doesn't matter who's in the way or what's in the way. They just want to make sure that they can get their profits, and our people suffer from it, because it doesn't matter if we try to get an injunction to prevent some activities, they're never really successful because of the common law and the way it's set up, that the balance of convenience usually falls to the corporations rather than to us when we're trying to protect some land, water, and resources. So, you look at, there's about what, maybe 150 billionaires in this world now. And how many you have? About 150 million poor people, probably more, you know. So corporations have a lot of impact on people. So that's one of the things at least I would like to see. So there are others, but we'll put that one out there.
Grand Chief, other Grand Chief?
I would say we've got to keep in mind that over the last 50 years, things have changed. You know, the legal landscape has changed. The Supreme Court of Canada now recognizes that Indigenous rights exist. For a long time, the Supreme Court of Canada had taken a position that we should just negotiate these rights and they wouldn't proclaim whether these rights exist or not. Now we have a Supreme Court of Canada that acknowledges that Indigenous rights exist. We also have the federal and provincial government through the international law, DRIPA, have made DRIPA domestic law. It was international law, now it's domestic law, both in Canada and in British Columbia. And what that does is it recognizes that Indigenous people have the right to govern themselves, right? The outstanding question, as Kat's talking about, is the question of land ownership. And when I was working with George Manuel, this is what George said: we're never going to sell our land. We're not going to do that. The position that we take is that we will govern our land. We will govern the existence of our Aboriginal title, and we'll share that land with the Europeans that are here. So what we're trying to accomplish in this round of treaty negotiations is the establishment or the reestablishment of our right to govern our people and to govern our land. How that government is going to play out, those is part of the negotiations. We want a large say in being stewards of the land, being stewards of the fisheries, being stewards of the forestry, because look what the government's done over the last 50 to 100 years with forestry. We are now mining and logging out parkland. All of the great big spruce trees that used to be here are all cut down for the Second World War. All the Fraser Valley used to be filled with these large 12-foot cedars. They're all gone. And look what's happening with fisheries. I mean, the fishing industry collapsed 20 years ago. And we're beginning to see the return of hooligans and some of these species that are coming back. We might have a good sockeye year this year, but it's only because the government has taken a stronger stance on managing the existing resource. They have to include Indigenous scientific knowledge on stewardship. They have to talk to our elders as to how to protect the habitat where they for a long time, the government took the view that Indians shouldn't fish in the spawning grounds because we were damaging the spawning ground. And now they take the view, oh, the Indians actually looked after this spawning grounds pretty good. And we should allow the Indians to go back to fishing the way they used to fish with traps and whatnot. So we're seeing change both in the legal landscape and the public governance landscape on account of international rule changes. Where changes have to happen is in the hearts and minds of the Canadians generally. Reconciliation doesn't start with DRIPA. It doesn't start with the Supreme Court of Canada. It starts with each and every person in Canada, how they feel in their heart about Indigenous people and what's happened to them. We have to have a change in the way they feel about Indigenous rights and Indigenous people, because our rights are a reality. We've never given them up. We're not going to give them up in the treaty process. We're not going to give up our land rights in the treaty process. What we're trying to do is reestablish our right to govern and be stewards of the land once again through the treaty process. And so this is, I hope, in my lifetime, you know, when working Since 1995, we established Stalo governance again with all of the Stalo bands. We got 24 Stalo bands. We got about 7,000 Stalo people. It's not a lot of people, but if we can get them under one roof again, under self-government, and begin to exercise our stewardship over the land in conjunction with the federal provincial jurisdiction, exercising our right to protect our resources through our governance structure without extinguishing our title to the land. That's what I'd like to see happen. And I'd like to see our next generation of leaders come up. I've been at it over, well, Cap and I've been at this too damn long. And the next generation have got to come up and understand that the torch is going to get passed to them to protect our rights on the one hand, to promote our rights to ownership of the land, and to develop our right to jurisdiction over fisheries, over forest management, over water, over our own children, over our own health, over our own education. We need to stand up and claim these jurisdictions back and to begin to write our own laws about those based on our own customs and traditions. And that's what I did in 1995. I wrote the Constitution for the Stalo, the House of Elders, House of Chiefs, the Youth Council, and the House of Justice. And that's what we're putting forward again to the Stalo people, the opportunity to come together to form government based on our traditional model. I was invited by the Lummies to come and talk to them about our model. They said they heard that we had a traditional governance model. And I said, yeah, we worked on it in 1995. And then I got invited to talk to the Harvard University because all the tribes in the United States are trying to get to traditional governance. And they heard that the Stalos had a traditional government model. And I went over there to talk to the Harvard University and all of the tribes in the United States that were at this governance project about our governance model. And we are developing a model similar in structure and intent as the Iroquois Confederacy, where we're bringing together our people based on our own values, based on our own respect for the 7 generations past and future, where we're bringing together our youth and training them in leadership. The House of Youth that we're creating is to be a training ground for our young people so they know how to step into the shoes of leadership when it's time for them to do so. We have an elders council that will be in charge of language and culture to preserve our historic knowledge, to guide the leadership when it's important to speak up about what they're doing. And the leadership council is made up of all the chiefs themselves who lead the people, whether they're elected or whether they're hereditary, it doesn't matter. However your community is selecting your leaders, that's fine. And so we're working on this. We passed the Constitution now at the community level in 4 communities. So we're going to go get our 5th community shortly. And I'm hoping that other communities, Stalo people, will see the wisdom of coming back together under self-government umbrella. Let's not extinguish our rights to the land. Let's promote our right to governance through stewardship of the land. Let's come back together as a Stalo nation. And if that can happen in my lifetime, that would be a great thing to see.
2 really big, tall orders to fill, but I think it comes from your lifetime of leadership, understanding that corporations have far too much power in our world today. And in order to make an impact or a difference, we have to do it together. You know, what I experienced as a young person, seeing leaders sitting around a big, huge boardroom table representing all of Stalo Nation, had a pretty powerful impact on me that I still remember today. And to understand that a lot of the work was untangled and, maybe separated for a reason. But part of that reason being because of the historical impacts of residential schools. Like Uncle Cat was saying at the beginning of the discussion, that lateral violence, that gossip, that unhealthy behavior that unfortunately seeps into a lot of the work that we're trying to do, the positive work that we're trying to do within our communities. And that the next generation that's coming up is stronger and healthier than I've ever seen. The amount of young people that are paddling, that are playing soccer, that are powwow dancing, that are participating in the winter ceremonies, it's growing. The amount of people that are drug and alcohol free, that are getting an education, it's growing. It's happening. And I think if we can hang on to these structures that our leaders have put in place, if we can build on the work that you have done and continue to create allyship within the communities that we live in, Chilliwack, British Columbia, Canada, those things will happen, and maybe we're closer than we think, than we've ever been before. I think it's pretty inspiring. And maybe one day my own thoughts are that the Canadian government will make room for Indigenous leadership to sit around that table as well. I think for a long time we've had our chiefs, and then we've had the Canadian governance system. And I really feel like something, again, just my own thoughts, would be to have Indigenous seats in the House of Parliament. That it's so important that they consult with us at every level. And they have not done that. And maybe one day that will also be a reality for all of us to see Indigenous leaders at the Parliament level. We're coming to the point in the discussion where we take questions about anything that we've talked about, questions that the viewers may have for either of you about the discussions that were brought to light today. And so usually what happens is our technical team will, take a look and they'll pass those questions on to us. So we just give a few minutes for any of those questions to come in. We've had people sort of popping in and out of the discussion today and watching live with us. And as we said at the beginning, afterwards, what we do is we take the whole recording and we put it on YouTube so that people can watch at any time later on. But we've heard that this format is really successful for people because they can log in from home and they get to be a part of a discussion, from the comfort of their own homes. It's very convenient for people. And so we've gotten a lot of really great feedback about having these monthly discussions online. And again, want to thank you for taking the time. I know you're both busy, but taking the time to be a part of this and allowing people to have access to your knowledge and knowing the history through your eyes, through your perspective. You're really experts in what you do. And so we're very lucky to even have captured this conversation in this way. And so really appreciate, want to put our hands up, from SXG, from the team to both of you for making yourselves available for this kind of discussion. It's funny because lots of times the people we invite to do these Zoom discussions are not familiar with the format, but because of COVID, it's become a lot easier. And most people do know how to, go on Zoom meetings. It's become the norm. And so being able to access you in this way and not have to come together it does make it a little bit easier, but I have to say, I miss meeting with people. I miss seeing people in the flesh. So used to seeing people on the screen all the time. So maybe one day we'll actually be able to get together in person and we can film that interaction. I think that would be really cool. So apparently you've given the audience all the information they need because there are no direct questions. There's been some comments, which I'm gonna check now just to see anything pertaining particular to what we've been talking about. So some people just comment as we go along that they're listening or they're enjoying the discussion. But any final thoughts that you may have regarding information people could access, the work around the discovery of the 215 moving forward, resources, just trying to think for myself. I love to follow the work that you're doing, Uncle Cat, and where people can maybe find that information, because you talked about, you know, maybe there's going to be a book published around this work, and of course, will that information be made public if there are discoveries around our territory, and how the community can further support your work?
One of the things that information Dave Shippey and his staff have put out a couple of reports, and I'm not too sure if he's got the okay to make them public to everybody, but he has put those together so that people understand what it is they're doing and how they hope to get to where they need to get to. And as I mentioned, we're just responsible for doing the interviews with survivors, and we haven't sat down and put together any kind of report to say how many survivors we've talked to and where they come from. We haven't done that yet. As I mentioned too, that it's going to be a slow process getting out to people because some people are reluctant to do it. Maybe they all change their mind in a bit of time after they think about it, but we'll have to wait and see where that goes. So I know I'd like to see it proceed a lot faster, but we're talking about people's experiences that they had, whether it was good or bad in schools, and some of them bad experiences. They don't want to talk about it. So, like I said, it'll take some time to get to a stage where they may be able to do that. And one of the things we try to do in terms of the interviews is to make sure that they have someone to talk to, like a counselor, after they done their interview. So, and we have to make sure that the interviewers are going to be getting help as well, because they have to sit there and listen to the stories.
I just want to add my thanks, Kat, to the work that you're doing. It's such important work. It's going to have tremendous impact once you're finished and you do write a report. Its implications, of course, for healing for our own people, but also for creating a better understanding about this whole issue of the missing children. So I wish you all the best, and I really want to thank you for coming on with us this evening. You're the most senior leader we have now in the Stalo Nation. You've been around the longest, and I value your perspective more than any other. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to also give everyone listening the resource of the Indian Residential School Society's 24-hour crisis line. You can call at any time if you need counseling or help of any kind. And that is available to everyone. The number is 1-866-925-4419. I'll repeat the number, 1-866-925-4419. And just one last comment from Joe. An app would help me reach more people. People love their apps on their phones. So just talking about perhaps an app version for some of the work of collecting people's either information or connecting residential school survivors is one idea that someone had who's listening in tonight. So we are going to wrap it up there on time. We did it on time, which is really excellent, and allow you both to get to your evenings, whatever it is you have planned. Maybe you're going to rest. I think that would be great for myself as well. And, virtual hugs to both of you and everybody listening. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We're going to wrap it up there. This has been our 4th edition of Light the Fire. Lahai.